The sun clawed at the earth, scorching the cracked plains until they bled dust. Her boots sank into the parched ground, each step a labor against the weight of her own body. She was a shadow stretched thin, her dress frayed at the hem, her hands trembling around a burlap sack that held nothing but a cracked locket and a half-empty flask. The horizon shimmered, mocking her with promises of water that never came. Her lips were split, her breath a ragged prayer. She'd been walking since the wagon left her 3 days, maybe 4. Time blurred under the relentless heat. They'd taken her coin, her name, and left her to the mercy of a land that had none. Somewhere behind her, buzzards circled, their wings slicing the silence. She didn't look up. Her knees wavered, but she pressed on, driven by something sharper than hunger, something that burned like defiance in her chest. The town came into view like a mirage, its wooden shacks hunched against the wind. A faded sign read Redemption, though the letters were peeling, half swallowed by dust. She stumbled through the empty street, past a saloon where laughter spilled like spilled whiskey, past a church with a crooked steeple that seemed to lean away from God. Her vision swam as she fell against a hitching post, the wood splintering under her weight. Faces turned hard, weathered faces of men and women who saw only a stranger, not a woman breaking apart. She clutched the locket, its edges biting into her palm, and whispered a name no one would hear. They found her there, slumped in the dirt, when the auction began. A man with a voice like gravel called out, his hammer poised over a makeshift podium. $5 for the girl, he barked, gesturing to her as if she were livestock. The crowd murmured, their eyes cold with indifference. She was too weak to stand, too broken to care. Her hair hung in tangled strands, her face streaked with dust and dried tears. The bidding started low, $1, then $2, each number a blade. Twisting in her gut, she closed her eyes, letting the world fade to the hum of voices and the creak of boots on wood. A shadow fell over her, and the air shifted. Mine, a voice said, low and steady, cutting through the din. She opened her eyes, squinting against the glare. A cowboy stood there, his hat tilted low, his coat dusted with the red earth of the plains. His hand was raised, not in triumph, but in quiet resolve. The crowd stilled, their whispers dying like a fire starved of air. The auctioneer hesitated, then nodded, his hammer falling with a dull thud. $5. Her worth, measured in coin. He knelt beside her, his eyes the color of storm clouds, searching her face without judgment. His hands were rough, calloused from rope and rain, but they moved gently as he offered her a canteen. The water was warm, tasting of metal and earth, but it slid down her throat like salvation. She coughed, her body trembling, and he steadied her with a hand on her shoulder. Can you walk? He asked, his voice soft but unyielding, like the wind over the plains. She nodded, though her legs betrayed her, and he half carried her to a horse tethered nearby. The animal snorted, its breath warm against her cheek as she leaned into its flank. The town faded behind them, swallowed by the vastness of the desert. He didn't speak, and she didn't ask his name. The silence between them was heavy, but not unkind, like the weight of a blanket on a cold night. The horse's rhythm rocked her into a haze, her mind drifting to the locket in her hand. Inside was a daguerreotype, faded but sharp enough to cut her sister's face, smiling, before the fever took her, before the wagon left her behind. She'd been running ever since, chasing a promise she couldn't name. The cowboy glanced at her, his eyes catching the glint of the locket, but he said nothing. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, and the world felt both cruel and impossibly tender. They stopped at a dry creek bed, where the earth was scarred with the memory of water. He built a fire, the flames licking at the darkness, and offered her a piece of hardtack from his saddlebag. She ate slowly, each bite a reminder of her hunger, her shame. The stars emerged, sharp and cold, and she wondered if they were watching her or simply waiting for her to disappear. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the night like stars falling in reverse. The cowboy sat across from her, his silhouette carved against the dark, his hands resting on his knees as if ready to move at any moment. The air smelled of sagebrush and smoke, sharp enough to sting her lungs. She clutched the locket tighter, its edges worn smooth from years of worry, and let her eyes trace the horizon where the last light bled into shadow. Her body ached, each muscle a map of the miles she'd walked, but the food in her stomach was a small anchor, tethering her to the moment. She didn't know his name, didn't know why he'd raised his hand in that dust-choked town, but the weight of his gaze felt like a question she wasn't ready to answer. The night was cold, the kind that crept into your bones and stayed there. She shivered, pulling her tattered shawl closer, and he tossed another branch onto the fire without a word. The flames flared, casting light across his face, lines etched deep eyes that held too much for one man to carry. She wondered what he saw in her, what made him pause in that auction when others turned away. Her mind drifted, unbidden, to the wagon train, to the faces that had once been family. They'd called her a burden, a mouth too many to feed, and left her with nothing but the locket and a name that felt less hers with every passing day. Clara. It sounded foreign now, like a word spoken in a language she'd forgotten. You got a name? He asked, his voice low, cutting through the quiet. She flinched, her fingers tightening around the locket. For a moment, she didn't answer, her throat too dry, her heart too heavy. "Clara," she finally said, the word brittle, as old bone. He nodded, as if it were enough, and leaned back against a rock, his hat tipped low. "I'm Elias," he said, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the fire. The name hung between them, simple and unadorned, like the man himself. She wanted to ask why he'd done it, why he'd paid $5 for a woman half dead and worth less than the dust on his boots, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she saw her sister's face in the locket, the memory sharp as a blade, her laughter by the river, her hands braiding Clara's hair, the fever that came like a thief in the night. Clara had been 14, then, too young to fight the world alone, but old enough to know what it meant to be left behind. The wagon train had moved on, her sister's grave a fresh wound in the earth, and Clara had carried the locket like a promise she couldn't keep. It shifted, pulling a blanket from his saddlebag and tossing it to her. It smelled of horse and leather, but it was warm, and she wrapped it around her shoulders, her fingers brushing the rough wool. "Sleep," he said, not unkindly. "We move at dawn." She nodded, though sleep felt like a luxury she didn't deserve. The ground was hard beneath her, the blanket a thin shield against the cold. She lay there, staring at the stars, each one a pinprick of light in a world that felt too vast, too empty. The fire's warmth reached her, faint but persistent, and for the first time in days, she let her eyes close in her dreams. The wagon wheels creaked again, rolling away through the dust. She ran after them, her voice breaking as she called their names, but they didn't turn back. The locket burned in her hand, her sister's face fading with each step. She woke with a start, her breath catching, the fire now a pile of glowing coals. Elias was awake, his back to her, his rifle resting across his knees as he watched the dark. The night was still, but she felt it, the weight of something unseen, something waiting beyond the fire's light. "You were talking in your sleep," he said, not turning. His voice was steady, but there was a softness in it, like the brush of wind over grass. She didn't answer, her cheeks warm with shame. The locket felt heavy in her hand, a tether to a past she couldn't escape. She wondered if he had a past like hers, one that clung like dust to everything he touched. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent, and she pulled the blanket tighter, the ache in her chest sharper than the cold. ***, dawn broke like a cracked egg, spilling pale light across the dry creek bed. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of frost and sage, and Clara's breath clouded as she stirred beneath the blanket. Her body ached, a dull reminder of the miles behind her, but the hunger in her gut was quieter now, tamed by the hardtack and the warmth of the fire as dying embers. Elias was already up, saddling the horse with slow, deliberate hands. His movements were precise, like a man who'd learned to trust only what he could touch. She watched him, her fingers tracing the locket's edges, its weight a constant pull against her heart. The desert stretched endless around them, its silence louder than any voice. They rode through the morning, the horse's hooves kicking up dust that stung her eyes. Elias kept his gaze forward, his hat low, but she felt his awareness of her, the way he shifted slightly when her grip on his waist faltered. She wanted to ask where they were going, what he intended for her, but the words felt like stones in her mouth. The land was vast, its colors muted grays and browns, broken only by the occasional flash of a lizard or the skeletal arms of a Joshua tree. It was beautiful in its cruelty, like a hymn sung in a language she couldn't understand. Her mind drifted again, back to the riverbank where her sister's laughter had once filled the air. They'd been children then, chasing minnows in the shallows, their dresses soaked and their voices bright. Clara could still feel the cool water on her skin, the weight of her sister's hand in hers. But the fever had come swift, stealing her sister's breath, leaving Clara to bury her alone. The wagon train had waited only a day before moving on, their faces hard with necessity. She'd screamed after them, her voice swallowed by the wind, until her throat was raw and her hands bled from clawing at the dirt. The locket was all she had left, a fragile thread to a life that no longer existed. The horse slowed, and Clara blinked, pulled back to the present. They'd reached a small homestead, its adobe walls weathered but sturdy, nestled against a low hill. A single mesquite tree stood in the yard, its branches gnarled like an old man's hands. Elias dismounted, offering her a hand without meeting her eyes. She took it, her legs unsteady, and felt the roughness of his palm, warm despite the morning chill. "This is home," he said simply, gesturing to the house. The word struck her like a blow. Home was a place she'd lost, not a thing to be claimed. Inside, the air was cool, smelling of earth and dried herbs. A table stood in the center, scarred from years of use, and a single chair sat by a small hearth. The walls were bare, save for a faded photograph of a woman with sharp eyes and a tight smile. Clara's gaze lingered on it, her chest tightening. Elias noticed but said nothing, busying himself with a kettle over the fire. "Rest," he told her, pointing to a cot in the corner. She sat, the locket still clutched in her hand, and watched him move with the quiet efficiency of a man used to solitude. He gave her coffee, bitter and black, and a piece of cornbread that crumbled in her fingers. She ate in silence, the food grounding her, though her mind still wandered to the auction, to the word mine that had pulled her from the edge of nothingness. Why her? She wanted to ask, but the question felt too big, too raw. Instead, she said, "Who's the woman in the photograph?" Her voice was hoarse, barely her own. Elias paused, his hands stilling on the kettle. "My sister," he said, the words clipped, like a door closing. He didn't look at her, but the air shifted, heavy with something unspoken. Clara nodded, her fingers tightening around the locket. She understood loss, the way it carved out pieces of you and left them scattered in the dust. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the wind outside. She slept that night on the cot, the blanket smelling of hymn leather and earth. Her dreams were fragmented. Her sister's face, the wagon wheels, Ilias's hand raised in the auction. She woke to the sound of a coyote's cry, sharp and mournful, and saw him sitting by the hearth, his eyes on the photograph. The firelight carved shadows across his face, and for a moment she saw her own grief mirrored there. Asterisk, asterisk, the days bled into each other, marked only by the sun's arc and the rhythm of Ilias's routines. Clara woke each morning to the clink of a kettle, the scent of coffee sharp in the cool air. The homestead was a small world, its walls a fragile barrier against the vastness outside. She moved through it like a ghost, her hands idle, her mind heavy with the locket's weight. Elias gave her tasks mending a torn shirt, tending the fire, small things that tethered her to the present. But her thoughts kept slipping back, to the wagon's dust trail, to her sister's shallow grave, to the auction where her worth had been measured in coins. Each memory was a stone in her chest, too heavy to carry, too precious to let go. Elias was a man of few words, his presence steady but distant, like a mountain on the horizon. He worked the land with a quiet ferocity, repairing fences, hauling water from a distant well, his hands always moving. She watched him, noting the way his shoulders tensed when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his eyes lingered on a photograph of his sister. Clara didn't ask about her again, but the silence between them grew thicker, woven with questions neither dared to voice. At night, by the fire, she caught him watching her, his gaze not unkind but searching, as if he saw something in her he couldn't name. One afternoon, a storm rolled in, the sky bruising purple over the hills. The wind howled, rattling the shutters, and Clara felt it in her bones, a restlessness that matched her own. She stood at the door, watching the dust swirl, her hand on the locket. Elias came up behind her, his shadow falling across the threshold. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low but firm. She turned, meeting his eyes for the first time in days. They were gray, flecked with something like sorrow, and she wondered what he'd lost to make them that way. "Why'd you do it?" she asked, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "Why'd you bid on me?" He didn't answer right away, his jaw tightening as he looked past her to the storm. The wind screamed, carrying grit that stung her face. "Didn't seem right," he finally said, "leaving you there." His voice was rough, like gravel underfoot, but there was a softness beneath it, a crack in the stone. She wanted to press him, to ask what he saw in her that was worth $5, but the storm's roar swallowed her courage. He stepped past her, pulling his hat low, and went to secure the horse. That night, the storm still raging, they sat by the fire, the air thick with the smell of rain and smoke. Clara's hands trembled as she opened the locket, her sister's face staring back, faded but sharp. "Her name was Leela," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias looked up, his eyes catching the firelight. She didn't know why. She spoke, only that the words needed air. "She was all I had. Fever took her. They left me after." The confession felt like shedding skin, raw and painful, but she couldn't stop. "I don't know why I'm still here." Elias leaned forward, his hands clasped, the fire casting shadows across his knuckles. "My sister's name was Sarah," he said, the words slow, deliberate. "She didn't make it through the winter. I wasn't here." His voice broke on the last word, and Clara saw it, the same weight she carried, the same guilt that clung like dust. They sat in silence, the storm's howl filling the space between them. For the first time, she felt seen, not as a shadow or a burden, but as someone who'd survived. The storm passed by morning, leaving the air clean and the earth damp. Clara stepped outside, the locket still in her hand, and saw the mesquite tree, glistening with rain. Elias joined her, his boots sinking into the mud. "There's a town a day's ride west," he said. "You could start there, or stay." The offer hung between them, fragile as the dawn light. She looked at him, then at the locket, her sister's face a quiet ache. The choice was hers: run toward a new life or stay in this one, where the past still breathed. The wind was soft, now carrying the scent of wet earth, and she felt something shift inside her, small but undeniable, like a seed breaking open. Asterisk, asterisk, the days stretched longer, the sun less cruel as autumn crept into the desert. Clara stayed, though she couldn't say why not out loud. The homestead became a rhythm. The creak of the well's pulley, the snap of firewood, the soft thud of Elias's boots on the packed earth. She learned the weight of a broom in her hands, the way dough yielded under her fingers, the quiet satisfaction of a mended fence. Her body grew stronger, though her heart still carried the locket's ache. Each morning she touched it, tracing her sister's face, but the pain was softer now, like a bruise fading under the skin. Elias watched her, not with the wariness of before, but with something closer to curiosity. He taught her to ride, his hands steady as he adjusted her grip on the reins. The horse, a mare named Juniper, snorted at her at first, but Clara learned to move with its rhythm, her fear giving way to a fragile trust. Out on the plains, with the wind in her hair and Elias a shadow beside her, she felt the world expand, its edges less sharp. He spoke little, but his silences were different now, less like a wall, more like a river she could cross if she chose. Her dreams still came, though Leila's laughter, the wagon's creak, the auction's cold voices. One night, she woke gasping, the locket clutched so tight it left marks on her palm. Elias was there, sitting by the fire, his rifle across his knees. "You called her name again," he said, his voice low, not accusing. She nodded, her throat tight, and he didn't press her. Instead, he handed her a tin mug of coffee, the warmth seeping into her hands. "I used to hear Sarah too," he said, his eyes on the flames. "Still do, some nights." Clara looked at him, seeing the lines grief had carved into his face, and felt the weight of her own loss lighten, shared in the quiet. The crossroads came on a morning when the air smelled of frost. Elias returned from town with supplies and a letter, its wax seal unbroken. He handed it to her without a word, his eyes unreadable. The letter was from a cousin in Denver, one she'd last seen as a child, offering a place to stay, a chance to start over. Clara held the paper, its edge crisp against her calloused fingers, and felt the world tilt. Denver was a name, a possibility, but it was also a leaving this place. This man who'd seen her when no one else had. She looked at Elias, his hat low, his hands busy with a rope, and wondered what it would cost to stay. That evening, they sat by the fire, the letter on the table between them like a third presence. "You don't owe me," Elias said, his voice rough but steady. "You're free to go." The words stung, though she knew they were true. She thought of Lila, of the wagon fading into the dust, of the auction where she'd been nothing but a price. Freedom was a word she'd forgotten, but it felt heavy now, like a choice she wasn't ready to make. "What if I stay?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her then, his eyes soft with something like hope, and for a moment, the silence was enough. She didn't decide that night, or the next. The letter stayed on the table, unopened. As the days turned colder, Clara worked beside Elias, her hands learning the land's rhythms, her heart learning his. They didn't speak of the future, but they shared the present, coffee in the morning, the mare's steady gait, the way the stars seemed brighter now. She began to see herself not as a shadow, but as a woman who could choose, who could build something new from the ashes of what was lost. The morning she chose, the sky was pale, the air sharp with the promise of winter. She stood by the mesquite tree, its branches bare but strong, and opened the locket one last time. Leila's face was still there, faded but eternal. Clara pressed it to her lips, then tucked it into her pocket. Not a weight now, but a memory she could carry. Elias was at the fence, his back to her, but he turned when she approached, his eyes catching the dawn's light. She didn't need to speak, her presence was enough. The wind was quiet, the earth steady beneath her feet, and she felt the first stirrings of peace, like a river finding its course.